Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley, and I am the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. You know that feeling when somebody really gets you? And I'm sure you also know the vastly different experience of not feeling understood or being with someone who appears tone deaf to who you are. Empathy is a big part of the difference, and it matters. Empathy is fundamental, learnable, and it is one of the skills that defines us as people. And yet, empathy is a commonly misunderstood skill. I am so happy to have an empathy expert to provide clarity and to show us how to grow it and to explain how it will improve our lives. My guest, Maria Ross, is a brand strategist, TEDx speaker, and an author who has written a must-read book called The Empathy Edge. Simply put, her book shines a light on the importance of empathy in our personal lives and in the workplace. Indeed, this one trait can be the difference maker for whether a relationship or company succeeds or fails. Business luminaries love her book, and one sums up the lion's share of accolades by saying it's a must-read for every manager and executive. I agree wholeheartedly and would add it's a must-read for every person, regardless of their work. So join Maria and me as we discuss the difference-making human superpower that is empathy. Maria Ross, welcome to Super Psyched.
I am super psyched to be here. I'm sure you've never heard that before.
I love hearing it nonetheless, especially from you. And it's actually a very empathic way to respond. You're responding with my words. But I couldn't be more excited to have a thoughtful conversation with you around this Jedi skill that humans can use in their daily life to live better in every which way, whether they're wearing the hat at home or at work, or just out in the world at Walgreens making a purchase, standing in line, having an empathic conversation with a stranger. But I'm wondering, since empathy is at the heart of everything I do as a psychologist, and yet there are so many misconceptions about what it is and what it isn't, let's start with what is empathy and how can we contrast it from, say, sympathy?
Yeah, so it was really interesting when I was researching the book. There are a lot of different definitions of empathy out there. And even every person I interviewed had a slightly different definition. And if you go back over time, the 1500s, the 1800s, empathy had a different definition. But that's partly because to your field especially, we've learned more about the brain, about how humans interact, about how they work, about psychology. And so it's kind of morphed into the definition where it is now. For the purpose of the book and the purpose of the work that I did, I chose to look at it through this lens, which is that empathy is about seeing something from another person's point of view. And where appropriate, potentially feeling those feelings, but it's not a requirement. And I think that's a huge sigh of relief for people when they think about empathy in the workplace. And then more importantly, using that information, using that perspective taking, that information gathering as a means to act and make a decision or communicate in a certain way. So it's a lens that provides input to then doing something with that information. And that's really where we talk about compassion. Compassion is sort of empathy in action. And to your point about how does it differ from sympathy, sympathy is really about slightly feeling sorry for someone. And maybe that's not the dictionary definition.
Yeah,
but that's
actually, it's consistent with the way I define it.
Yeah. But yeah. And it's really about looking at someone sort of detached from them. Like, oh, this thing is happening to them and I have sympathy for them. Now, the interesting thing is back in the 1500s, the word sympathy actually meant what today's empathy means.
Exactly.
If you look at like a famous play was called Tea and Sympathy, it meant what we deem today as empathy. But Brene Brown, speaking of her as we were before the interview started, she has a great video of a talk she did where she talked about the difference between empathy and sympathy. Someone had created an illustrated video of the concept. And it was sympathy is you fell down a well and I'm at the top of the well and I'm saying, looking down at you and saying, that really sucks that you're down that well. I really feel sorry for you. Empathy is grabbing a ladder and crawling into the well and putting your arm around the person and saying, I'm here for you.
I love that
I'm in this with you
image so much, because oftentimes people look at empathy and think of it as kind of a soft skill. And yet firefighters are constantly executing on empathy. Emergency responders are executing on it. And the best leaders in the world execute on it and we'll be talking about some of how that plays out. But yeah, empathy is really a big deal. And it really flies in the face of mind reading, because we don't know what it's like to be another person. And we often think we do. And we actually have to find out and actually kind of feel the feels of the other person in order to really ascertain, am I on the same page or am I making assumptions?
And I think from a workplace perspective, what empathy is not is it's not just being nice. It's not caving into crazy demands.
Totally.
That's acquiescence. That's not empathy. But it's not sitting on the floor crying with your employees. I think that's another image people get is I've got to be this person I'm not, right?
Exactly. Being authentic.
And also this idea of it's also not agreeing with each other. I think that's a big aha for people, is that you can have empathy for another person and you can feel empathy and understand their context, understand how they got to their point of view, but it doesn't mean you have to agree with it. And if we look at workplace conflict, if we look at political conflict, that's the skill that's required, is how are we still able to look at someone as a human being and be in it enough to ask questions and try to understand their point of view and where they're coming from, to be able to say, I still don't agree with you, but I totally understand how you got there. And that takes a lot of confidence and courage.
So true. You know, I was interviewing Tanya Israel, who wrote a book called Beyond Your Bubble, having conversations with people with whom you disagree politically. And it's just coming from that exact place that you were describing of not agreeing, but being willing to say, okay, it makes sense at least that this person came to that conclusion based on his or her experiences. And I think that's a really important skill to be able to rock during these really tough times where we feel so polarized and maybe feel so separate based on ideas that don't necessarily have to divide us. We might actually be great neighbors or even great friends and disagree on certain ideals.
Absolutely. I think the important thing there too is, again, understanding that it doesn't mean you agree, but at least if you're listening and you stay in the conversation, you can find common ground. That's the thing everyone laments right now, is everything is an argument. And here's why I'm right and you're wrong. And here's why I'm right and you're wrong. And then nothing moves forward from there. It's like, okay, then do you just cancel the relationship? Or if you're able to approach it with empathy, you can at least maybe find a way forward and find where you agree. And maybe you do soften each other a little bit of like, oh, I can see that point, or I can see that point. Here are the things we both agree that we both want. How can we move forward from there? And that could mean that you end up, quote unquote, convincing someone of your point of view, or it can mean that you just find a way forward together.
It's so interesting to hear you describe it that way. I often think about anger and how it makes us really stupid at times, because our amygdala, which is responsible for it, can hijack our higher cortex. And when we are willing to override the need to be right, and we'll talk about this later, and to make somebody else wrong by comparison, we actually kind of get dumber. But when we are able to kind of see the world a little bit more fully through the eyes of another, we actually become smarter. We're able to say, even though that's not how I rock it in this lifetime, I can kind of get how they got where they are. Yeah. And I think that really empathy is an invitation to becoming smarter in many ways. What do you think?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I just saw a blog post by Seth Godin the other day that talked about making a point versus making a difference. And making a point feels good in the moment because you're lecturing someone and you're making a point. But if you approach it with empathy, you actually have the opportunity to make a difference, which is a longer lasting effect. And that's exactly what you're talking about, this need to be right. I've learned so many lessons about empathy from my son, who's 7 years old, and working with a parent coach on some ways that we were dealing with him. And it's that whole thing that she explained the exact same thing to us. It's when they're in the temper tantrum mode, they've flipped their lid. And that's when the cognitive functions are offline. And so there's no way of getting through when they're in that state. You have to wait to calm it before then you can actually have the discussion or the consequence or the discussion about responsibility or about discipline or about whatever it is. You can't have it in that moment where everyone's head's exploding.
Totally. They're not open for business at that moment.
No. And as someone who had a brain injury and suffered some cognitive deficits, that's a big deal of being able to get that executive function level thinking back online to be more productive. And so, as you feel it in your body, you feel it in your tone of voice, you feel it in your reaction, you start reacting instead of responding. And empathy calls us all, myself included, because I'm not great at this. And that's why I wrote a book about it. But it calls us all to take that step back when we're in those tense moments or those heated discussions. And not every moment has to be tense or heated to require empathy. But that's, I think, where we associate the need for it the most.
That's absolutely spot on. You bring up Seth Godin, and I remember seeing him present at a sales conference in 2004, different lifetime, back when I was in the corporate sphere. It was by far the best presentation I've ever seen in my life. And he did it from a very empathic perspective. He did not have text-laden PowerPoint slides. He had images that were evocative and memorable. And I think about that great Maya Angelou quote that's been corroborated by neuroscience that is something akin to, people will forget what you said or did, but they'll remember how they felt when they were with you. And what could be more important than conveying a feeling and letting a person know that, hey man, I feel you. I am on the same page. I get it. And even if I don't necessarily agree with you, I totally feel you. And in that beautiful confluent space, a relationship can occur. And then I also think about you being someone who survived a brain aneurysm and how it kind of got you into this sphere, partially because the hospital that was attending to you was so empathic in its culture and was just going overboard on really assisting you from a place of empathy and how it was a contributor to your miraculous recovery. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what happened to you and how you kind of caught the empathy bug.
Yeah, it's really funny. There was kind of a confluence of things that led to writing this book. But early on in 2008, I had a ruptured brain aneurysm and nearly died. I don't remember the month of August of that year. But when I reflected back on the experience that we had in the hospital, it was one of those things where we thought, wow, that people that are here are so amazing. Like the rules and the policies that the hospital has about letting me choose my own meals, and no one ever addressed me without using my first name. I felt like a human being in an environment that can really dehumanize you. And later, when I volunteered for the hospital, I realized that wasn't an accident. It was actually empathy by design. And it's a movement in healthcare called patient and family-centered care, which you kind of go, duh, it should be, right? But it's really about operationalizing empathy. So not just relying on hiring a bunch of really nice, empathetic people, because empathetic people are drawn to healthcare. And many of them in hospitals everywhere are very empathetic, but they're operating in an environment that doesn't let their natural empathy flourish because of certain protocols, policies, procedures, what they're rewarded for, what they're measured by. And patient and family-centered care requires these hospitals to put measures in place to operationalize empathy. So, having patient advisors that give feedback on the experiences, and then that's embedded into future policies and future training and communication. And so you come to realize it's not a happy accident that you get this amazing experience. And what is so interesting to me as a business strategist is that means anyone can do it. That means any organization can really embrace empathy and make it a part of their culture and their mode of operation. So it's not just, oh, that will never be us because we've got some really bad directors, or we've got, that's just not the culture we have here. Well, as I talked about in the book, organizational culture is not a law of physics. It's something that we create as human beings, which means we can create the one we want. We don't have to follow the old paradigms. And as you know from reading the book, the great news is that the data and the research support that's actually not just a great way to do business, it's profitable.
I love that fact so much. I don't even have words. I've really caught the bug around positive leadership, but just going back to you being in that vulnerable state back in 2008 and having that system under you, that very intentional and repeated system whereby all of the employees of the hospital, you were one of the stakeholders, understood and repeated, and through intentional effort, ideas that would really hardwire empathy throughout the system and how you were the beneficiary. And I think about these executives who say, it's all about the people, except for the fact that they except it's not. And they say it great,
right.
But how incumbent it is for businesses to start engaging in these positive practices and that they are actually profitable. A lot of people have become lionized, kind of these tough guys in the system that have rocked these really kind of people unfriendly practices. And sure, they can kind of work, but they're not sustainable. And they don't actually benefit all stakeholders in the way that you're proposing as a brand strategist, as a business person who has come to recognize that empathy may be the North Star for good business practices. You dedicate your book to your son, Callum, which I think is beautiful, which to me implies that you're hoping that businesses will adopt empathy. And especially in the face of AI, where one of the differentiating factors is going to be our ability to empathize. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how businesses benefit tremendously on all levels to all stakeholders through rocking empathy.
The interesting thing about what you just said is that this is a movement, right? This isn't just me. This is something that's happening generationally. And just like we had sort of an industrial revolution and an information technology revolution, there is an empathy revolution bubbling up because Gen Z and millennials are still, they're in their 40s now. So they're not the young whippersnappers they were, but they are demanding a different type of workplace paradigm. And so any company or leader that chooses not to go this route is going to be extinct. Like, I can't say it any more strongly than that. They will not attract top talent, and therefore they will fall behind their competitors. And so if for any reason to learn how to strengthen your own empathy as a leader and to create a business environment and a culture that's empathetic, it's the most base of motives. It's your own survival. And we'll talk later about why that's not necessarily a bad thing to use that as a carrot for companies and leaders to do it. But there are many ways that an empathetic culture and being an empathetic leader benefits an organization. We can talk about a few of them right now. Number one is that studies have shown that empathetic organizations, empathetic cultures boost innovation and productivity. They have been shown to introduce more innovations to the market, to be more collaborative teams, to increase employee morale, which leads to better customer service. I mean, there's sort of like a knock-on effect of all of this. And Google is a famous study that's cited again and again. Years ago, they took a look at their most profitable and innovative products. And they looked at the makeup of the teams that created and got those products to market. And to their surprise, it wasn't necessarily the A teams in terms of like computer technology skills or where they'd graduated from college or all the things that they had always said were the hallmarks of being able to innovate. It was actually the teams that showed high competencies in collaboration, empathy, and communication. And my theory on that is that if you have a team like that, where risk is encouraged, where people can get along, they can collaborate, they can be willing to see each other's point of view, you actually get a better product and you actually move forward and get it to market. There's none of the drama, right? There's none of all the barriers that get in the way because of our interpersonal skills. And that's why it's so funny to me that they're called soft skills, because they're anything but soft. I mean, if they get in the way of you actually producing and delivering a solid product to the market, that's not a soft skill, my friend. That is a hard skill.
Well, it's kind of like a Jedi moving an object through air. Yeah. It's like profound, spectacular, and quite frankly, magical in many ways. I mean, you also cite that it reduces attrition, increases retention, and brand strength is, I mean, you described Southwest Airlines and how they've been really rocking it. There have been certain companies that have just been throwing strikes in the empathy department, and you're seeing like, this is actually good for business. Yeah. And that makes me so happy.
It makes me so happy because we've got to keep shining a light on those models so that we understand that there's a different way to do things. We're evolving from the old paradigms of it's competitive at all costs. It's stab each other in the back. It's hoard information. It's command and control. Those are the ways we're going to get to success. They may have worked in previous generations. They're not going to work in a time of rapid change, because we are in a time of unprecedented change in markets. I mean, we witnessed it firsthand the last 18 months, 2 years, but this won't be the last big market shift event that happens. And in order to adapt to change quickly, that requires a team effort. It's not a solo effort. It requires teams working together to adapt to that change. What helps teams work together? Being able to form interpersonal relationships very quickly and very genuinely in order to adapt to that change. And so that is going to be the number one skill this century, is going to be that. You can kind of lump it under the emotional intelligence umbrella, but that ability to interact with people is no longer going to be a soft skill. It's going to be a must-have.
And one of the great things is it's a virtuous cycle. Like the more it's practiced, the better we become. The more it's appreciated, the greater it appreciates in general. And I'm thinking about how even though work and our personal lives are kind of separate, they're not, in that we still carry the echoes of work to home and home to work. And the abilities to be empathic at work can translate to being more empathic at home. And one of the things that shows up most frequently when I'm working with couples or even individuals who are struggling in the relationship realm, which is probably the chief complaint in my office, like relationship stuff. The first thing I go to is like, how's your empathy skills and how do we increase those? And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how do you increase empathy skills? What have you seen that works?
Well, I was able to study a few techniques or habits that work really well for people. And the great thing about being able to write the book is now I have this list in front of me that I've called on quite often in the last year, and especially as a parent. But there are a few things that people can do to strengthen that empathy muscle. And I just want to bring back to that point you made, is that it is a muscle. So it may have atrophied for some people because they were in environments where it wasn't celebrated or modeled or rewarded. We're hardwired as human beings for empathy. It's how our species has survived. And so if your muscle has atrophied, that's okay. But that means you got to go to the gym and work out. And that also means you don't just do it once and you've mastered it. You don't just go to the gym once and all of a sudden you have 6-pack abs, right? You have to go multiple times. So you have to keep practicing, and it will feel forced at first or unfamiliar or uncomfortable even. And you might get people going, hey, what's going on with you? Why are you all of a sudden like listening to me? And
exactly. Who is this person?
But the more, like you said, the more you do it, the more it becomes part of your muscle memory. And so one of the biggest things that I discovered that's so important to empathy, like with all good things in psychology, is it starts inside. And practicing presence is a key component to strengthening your empathy. So if you can get your own house in order, if you will, and silence the noise in your brain and all the fears and the insecurities and the doubts, you can be more present to take in someone else's point of view without defensiveness or fear. So mindfulness is not just this woo-woo thing. It's actually extremely practical for success.
Totally.
And that could mean anything. It could mean mindfulness experts say even 5 minutes a day is enough to kickstart. Just try to do something every day for mindfulness so you don't negotiate with yourself. But that could be yoga or meditation. It could be sitting in silence with a cup of coffee. It could be no screen time until 8:00. It could be going for a walk or going for a jog or knitting. Whatever it is for you that actually helps you get into the moment and calm your body, calm like that hamster wheel going on in your head. I have found that deep breathing before a particularly tense conversation or meeting, or like a big high stakes meeting or presentation, is wonderful for getting that grounding and going, okay, now by doing this, I can get outside of myself and I can see the people in front of me. Otherwise, I'm all up in my head. Everything's
totally
spinning. And so that's one. The other is to really get comfortable with getting curious. So curiosity is the number one trait of empathic people. And it's because what you said earlier, it's not about making assumptions about the other person's point of view. It's about asking and not guessing. And the more that you can get curious, the 3 magical words in any conversation are tell me more.
Absolutely.
Even if someone's maybe saying something you vehemently disagree with about a budget proposal or a strategy or a political stance.
Or something that hurts your feelings.
Yeah. It's stopping with the like, here's why I'm right and you're wrong that we talked about earlier, and getting curious to find out what that person means and what the context is. And then the kicker, as you know from your work, is to actually listen to the answer.
Totally.
And not just wait for your opportunity to say something as rebuttal. So a great technique I've been working on as well, but also I found in my research, is just the reflection back without judgment or discernment in the reflection. So what I hear you saying is that you believe this strategy is the wrong one because of X, Y, and Z. Did I hear that right? Before I offer any opinions about it. And that does two things. One, you feel heard and the tension of the conversation goes down. And also we can ensure we're on the same page. Because if I think you've said something else and we continue to have this discussion with my false assumption, we're never going to get anywhere. You know this better than anyone, but it's that ability to actively listen. I've been working with an amazing training, this man named Edwin Rutsch out of Berkeley, California. He runs the Center for Building Empathy, I believe. And they do trainings with people from around the world on running empathy circles, what they call empathy circles. And I would say it's actually an exercise in isolating your active listening muscle to the point of discomfort, to the point of, oh, but I like going back and forth and asking questions about what somebody just said. And it's like, nope, someone has 5 minutes to talk. And as they're talking, they pause and they let you reflect what they've said, again, without you judging or asking further questions. When it's your turn to talk, you can follow up with whatever you want to follow up with. And they've done this technique at the most divisive political rallies that we've had in the country the last 4 years. And they've gotten people from both sides into these empathy tents as a result. And these people have left hugging.
Wow.
They don't leave agreeing, right? Back to our point before, but they leave going, I see you as a human.
Totally. And one of the things that you also talk about is assuming positive intent. And I think that's so important because we are always attuned to what's out there that could hurt me and who's to blame. And that's kind of how we're wired. And one of the things that we need to do in those moments when we're trying to actually listen to somebody is truly listen. And one of the things I learned best was from my improv class. I did improv for 2 years. And one of the things that you learn to do, be present, is but you also hear the other person's voice as they're speaking as if it were your own. And I can model that in person. It's a little bit more difficult to do over a podcast, but I've used it to great effect for couples, for people with ADHD who are struggling to get through a class, or people who are bored in meetings. If you can hear your own voice over the other person's voice, literally saying the exact same thing verbatim, it cuts out the chatter and it makes it a little bit easier to hear. And to your point, being able to reflect back, that's really at the heart of what Harville Hendrix, who's probably one of the most important voices in couples work, talks about in his imago therapy, and something that is really tempting to editorialize after you hear what somebody's saying, but you don't editorialize. You just say back what you heard and without comment. And that's a very difficult thing to do. I also hear myself thinking about the fact that you're talking about how innate this is. And for anybody who really wants to see just how innate our need for empathy is, Ed Tronick out of Harvard University came up with the still face experiment, where you see a little baby and her mother, and the mother and she have such a good relationship. You can see that they're in concert. They understand each other, even though they're using nonverbals. There's just such a beautiful back and forth. And then the mother is instructed, don't worry, it doesn't cause long-term damage, to give a still face, to not respond nonverbally to the baby. And the baby begins to immediately just tell something's wrong and begins to lose control of herself. And we all have that experience. When we're at the rental car place and the person behind the desk is not looking at you or not listening to your needs, and maybe even texting during your transaction. It's like, but I'm here. Please pay attention to me. I'm here. And I just flew in from, Dallas, and I'm really tired. Meanwhile, the still face experiment really speaks to that, just how we are wired to it. Another fantastic finding in psychotherapy is there are approximately 600 known modalities of psychotherapy: cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, psychoanalysis, a whole bunch. And the finding has been that they all work. But the key factor is, does the combination of the two people in the room work? Does the client feel felt by the therapist? And if the client doesn't feel felt, it's not going to work. Of course, this is assuming competence of the therapist and to deal with whatever the client is bringing, but the client must feel felt. Otherwise, the prognosis is not great. So to your point earlier, yeah, this is a really big deal. And there are just so many places where empathy really, really matters.
This idea of assuming positive intent is something like I feel in my own relationships. And granted, there are situations where someone doesn't have positive intent. Like we're not Pollyannas here thinking that this is the world. But for the most part, I realize the most conflicts that my husband and I have, for example, are because of the baggage of him saying something and me going back to like the other times he said it and what was intended then and assuming it's the same bad intent now. Instead of just being in the moment and listening to what our actual argument is about. He does the same thing to me. And it's this idea of we develop these patterns with people that we know where it prevents us from assuming positive intent because we're like, oh, here we go again with this thing. And it's this thing that I've realized that's the most destructive thing that happens in our communications is when we realize that we're not reacting to the situation in front of us. We're reacting to the 50 that happened before. And empathy, again, requires that presence of like, that may have been true before, but what's actually happening now, here, you and I in this situation. And so at work, what that could look like is if you're able to understand that context of somebody else, you might realize they're not just trying to hinder your project. What's in this for them is that they did a similar project like this at their past company and they lost their job as a result of it. So that's what's happening in that dynamic. It's not necessarily the dynamic of what's happening in the moment. It's the quote unquote baggage they're bringing to it where they're not assuming positive intent in this situation. And that's hard as we get older and we get more jaded and we get more experienced and we get hurt more. And so that's an interesting thing to see. Does empathy, this might be a question we explore is, does empathy wane as you get older or does it get stronger as you get older and you have more life experiences?
Such a great question. And I think my knee jerk, I'd be curious to hear what yours is, that it depends, like most things, on our pre-existing histories, on the people we're dealing with. Are we dealing with people who are trying to take advantage of us, where positive intent cannot be assumed?
Right.
Are we dealing with leaders who have our best interests at heart? I mean, we've seen what happens to people when they are either at a company or come from a country where the authorities cannot be trusted. It changes a person for a period of time, perhaps even their entire lives. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it has to depend on what those life experiences have been. And so for me, I feel like, maybe it's because writing a book on empathy and researching empathy and realizing the powerful impact it can have on your success is I'm actively working on it as I get older. But maybe if I had had really negative experiences in my past, which I did, and those could have shaped me to go the opposite way, to become that person that doesn't trust anybody, that always assumes negative intent. I think it has to depend on the experiences you've had as you get older and what truths are getting hardwired into your psyche as you age. And are they ones that you're questioning as you get older? Or are they ones you're sort of digging you're doubling down on as you get older?
Yeah. Are we expanding or are we occluding as we get older? That's such a great way of looking at it.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
And what you're speaking to there in that, from where I sit, is like, what is the world that you want? What is the world that you're co-creating? And of course, oftentimes we just really, depending on how dire things are, this concept of co-creation actually diminishes. It's like, actually, I'm living in a hellhole and I'm just trying to survive here. That brings out a whole other thing. And we could really go off the rails and kind of talk about Viktor Frankl and how he was surviving in the camps and trying to determine what his final freedom was, which was to decipher what reality meant at any given time. But let's go something a little easier. You throw out a hack that actually blew my mind in the book. And that was watching foreign films can help increase our empathy. And that made me so giddy with joy as one who's lived in foreign countries, as one who's really tried to expand my understanding of the human experience by hearing the voices of people whose lives and worlds are so different from my own. I think that's probably assisted me along the way. And I didn't even know it. Could you speak about whether it's acting in playing a role that might be different from who you actually are in real life, or watching foreign movies and other ways of building our empathy muscle that could be quite delightful as we're acquiring it.
Yeah, that's one of the fun habits is actually, and not just foreign movies, I label it exploring with your imagination. So, and how can you explore with your imagination in a safe way? You can watch films, documentaries, consume music, look at art that either represent a different point of view or are made by people who have a very different life from you. And as a sometime actress in my spare time, theater and film are such powerful ways to develop your empathy muscle because you're able to think about what would I feel if I was in that situation in a safe environment. You're able to see things from someone's point of view in an environment where the stakes are low, just watching the movie or reading the book or listening to the music. And it's this idea of being able to practice putting yourself in a situation you've never been in or putting yourself in the shoes of someone else. And the double whammy there, the bonus, is that stories actually humanize us. So when you hear about some statistic around like 10,000 people suffering from such and such, we can tend to block that out. But if you hear about the story of one person and their two sons dealing with this situation, it becomes a much more human perspective. And you can start to think, okay, what would I feel like if I was in that situation? Or now I understand why people like that person have the worldview that they have. And as an actress, one of the things they tell you is when you're getting into a character who's nothing like you, let's say you're playing a quote unquote evil character, you never play them evil. You never play them bad because they don't think they're evil or bad. You have to actually get into the shoes of like, why is this person acting in this way? They had a bad childhood. They had a hurtful relationship. They lost something very dear to them. And so you don't play them as bad. You play them as who they are based on their motivations.
I love that. I had dinner with, I'm going to totally name drop right now, Len Lesser, who played Uncle Leo in Seinfeld, who was this, if anybody who remembers Uncle Leo, he was this insufferable character who was always talking about his boy Jeffrey and how much better he was than Jerry Seinfeld. And you kind of hate this character. And when I asked him what it was like to play Uncle Leo, he said, I loved Uncle Leo. And I thought that was really beautiful.
Yeah.
Like in every actor that I've heard interviewed about having portrayed somebody awful, they've always felt profound empathy for this person because they got them. They were understood.
You have to, or you can't play a role. And so granted, not all of us are acting in a production, but we can exercise that muscle by watching movies, reading books, reading nonfiction, reading biographies, listening to music, world music, watching foreign films, and trying to practice thinking about what it's like to be someone who's not me. And that is a very safe environment that then you can do that when you're in the real world and you're at work and you're dealing with colleagues. You can start to flex that muscle of imagination to say, okay, maybe I can find a way to understand this person's context and move forward together. So that's just a really fun way. And I love that it gives us permission to binge on Netflix and do whatever we need to do.
Totally. It's like, well, I'm just doing this to increase my empathy muscle.
I'm becoming a more empathetic person by sitting in front of the TV for 6 hours. Yeah.
Absolutely. I just watched the first 2 seasons of Never Have I Ever. And it's about a girl whose mom is from India and she's born in the United States and her father has died. And her experiences are totally similar to my own in certain ways. And yet, obviously, she comes from a culture that's very different from my own. Mm-hmm. And it's very easy to be empathic towards this character. She's awesome. And it's such a great show. But I think that Netflix has plenty of options. So do podcast interviews. Just listen to an interview with Abby Wambach, whose life, she's one of the leading scorers in women's soccer. She's number 2 of all time. And her life is entirely different from my own. And I loved seeing the world through her eyes. And I think everybody should do that. We tend to go with interviews with people like us. And it's really incumbent upon us to really get the perspectives of people who are not like us to build that muscle. So I take great joy in that. I'm also in a book club and we often read from perspectives of people who are spectacularly different from ourselves.
Right.
And just to be able to walk through their world. So there's so many great ways to build it. And basically, I'm guessing you do, Maria, that I'm so behind your book. I think it should be required reading for everybody in the workplace and anybody who's even not in the workplace, just because, but it makes me happy in particular that you're addressing what I consider to be a profound need to assist the workplace in particular with this skill, because so much of our life is spent there. And if we continue to run as rat racers who don't experience a world of empathy through this part of our lives that occupies so much of the pie chart of our life, oh my gosh, what are we hardwiring? So I consider it required reading. That said, is there anything I should have asked but haven't yet?
I just wanted to get back to something we started with, which was this idea of like empathy being good for business. And some people kind of cringe at that we're trying to get people to adopt disingenuous empathy. And that's not the point, because I have actually seen that empathy can transform people from the inside out. So if you start adopting empathy, quote unquote, for potentially selfish reasons, you can't help but get transformed by that. And I've often said it's sort of like being pregnant. It doesn't really matter how you got there. You're going to be a parent. So if you decided that you wanted to be a more empathetic leader because you want to grow profits and you want to have a better career and you want to be the person everyone wants to work for, go for it. Because once you start adopting an empathetic lens, you're there. You're doing it.
That's such a great point.
And so it's the most empathetic thing we can do is to meet people where they are. And we have seen that moral arguments alone don't change people. So we do need to give them something in it for them to get them to see that this is a good way to operate in the world.
Such a great point. And we're not just Spocks. We're not Vulcans who just think about logic. We care about, we're feeling beings. And this idea of feeling or modeling the behavior before you become it, kind of a fake it till you become it, so to speak. I've seen that work. I mean, I remember being in Japan and watching children learning to say thank you at a very young age. And they may not have felt the gratitude yet, but by saying it enough, over time, they begin to recognize, oh, this is gratitude. And I love that you were even able to describe that people high on the autism spectrum can learn empathy skills just by learning these skills, that these are really learnable. That said, and if you were somehow conferred with the magical skills to give the world one insight or one practice as it relates to empathy, what would it be? And what do you imagine the impact would be on the individual as well as society?
Oh my gosh, we're living it right now, aren't we? And if we could live in a world where everyone was more empathetic and could see things from another person's point of view or from the point of view of people who are not like them, we would be making decisions that are good for each other, not just good for ourselves. And we would be collectively doing things that support the community that we're in, not just me or my own family or my own team or my own whatever. We would be able to be more collaborative as a society.
As I hear you say this, Maria, I'm just thinking, first of all, yes, may it be so. And second, there's an old Jewish folktale of a man being escorted to the afterlife and being given the option of either going to heaven or hell. And he says, well, let me see both. The first place he goes to is hell. And in front of him is a beautiful banquet hall with delicious food. And he's thinking to himself, wow, this doesn't look so bad. Except for the fact that everybody who comes to the table to eat has these grotesquely long arms and they can't feed themselves and they are emaciated and starving. And then he says, okay, that's pretty terrifying. And let's see heaven. Heaven looks exactly the same. A big banquet hall, delicious food, and people with these really long arms, except they look real well fed, which he can't quite yet understand. And they see is when they sit down, they start feeding each other. And that's heaven.
Oh, I love that.
Isn't that a great story?
What a great story.
And to your point, the world that you're seeing is one that we are actually feeding each other in a very kind, nurturing, loving way that actually benefits, as I hear it, everyone.
Yes. Amen.
May it be so. Well,
may it be so.
Maria, I am so grateful to you for taking time. I'm so grateful to you for having written this book and for sharing your wisdom with my listeners.
Oh, it's been so fun, Adam. Thank you so much. And thank you for the support and all the great things that you're doing to help people be more mindful and be more present and be more engaged in their relationships. I think that's the first step.
Well, you are my partner in this pursuit. And even though we're doing it you're out in Pacifica and I'm here in Silicon Valley, but we're doing it together. Sister.
Exactly.
Thanks so much. This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.